Good morning. Welcome to the Extravaganza. Yes. We were trying to come up with some music to pump people up and we ran out of time. So that's what you got. Welcome. Thank you for coming. I think we should take a moment and just bask in how lucky we are to all be together in the same room. Doesn't it feel good? Okay. So today's session is supposed to be sort of an unconference session in which we will talk about the things that you want to talk about. So there is a poll that you can take. It's tallyspace.com/vote/4437. And I know a lot of you have already voted. Thank you. And so when we get to that portion of the session, we'll talk about the things that you want to talk about. Very quickly, here's what we're going to do. We're going to introduce ourselves. Then we're going to do a super short 10-minute year in review of social media. And then we will break up into groups and talk, and then have a final kind of come back together where we share out some of the things that we talked about. So I'll start. I'm Dana Allen-Greil. I am the Chief of Web and Social Media at the National Archives, and I'm Dana Muses on Twitter.
And I'm Phillippa Pitts. I'm the Associate Educator for Gallery Learning at the Portland Museum of Art in Maine, and I'm on Twitter at Tertiary Source.
I'm Margaret Sternbergh, and I am from the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, most recently in the past 3 months. So I also spent the past 5 years at the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C., and I do gallery interpretation. And yeah.
Hello, I'm Jessica Warchall. I'm with the Andy Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I'm the Assistant Communications Manager. I do public relations, social media management, and web content.
And I'm Jennifer Poleon. I am the Digital Communications Manager at Columbus Museum of Art. And if you were in here earlier, you heard my presentation on Mobile Photo Now, which is the big mobile photography exhibition that I organized earlier this year. And I'm in charge of everything to do with digital at the museum, so everything from the web to our social media strategy, and et cetera.
And we're looking forward to getting to know the rest of you in the breakout. So again, if you want to vote, this is the link to vote. tallyspace.com/vote/4437. All right. So, year in review. We went through a very rigorous process to come up with the top 10 things in Muse Social from the last year, which involved us having a Google Hangout and then having lunch yesterday, and also focus grouping at happy hours. So we'll start with number 10.
Yep. So I think this is emblematic. Last year at this time, we were talking about the Met's response to Kim Kardashian's Break the Internet, and I think this idea that museums are responding more in real time to things like that are happening is a good example of what's been going on more as a trend, like with the dress, with what the Getty did, and things like that.
Talking to ourselves. This is something I'm really interested in as a trend, because we've seen sort of this evolved before with things like When You Work at a Museum and Tumblr and things that were more commentary, but we've really started seeing a pickup in dialogue that started with Museums Respond to Ferguson and then grew out of that into Museum Workers Speak. Literally, those people met on the hashtag Museums Respond to Ferguson. The hashtag Museum Swear Jar also iterated off of Museum Workers Speak. So we're having all of these dialogues across the country, across institutions about our practice. But what's really interesting is that there are also conversations that are happening in the public eye. These are not things that we're saying in a room at a conference to each other. They're things that we're saying and publishing online. And that makes it a slightly different trend.
And a plug for a session tomorrow more about this topic called Putting the Social in Social Media tomorrow morning.
This year, we're seeing some friendly competition between institutions. We saw Museum Bowl right off in January, and a little friendly plug over everything else, Irreverent Storytelling today. And this was 2 paintings, 2 museums, a friendly competition wager. It was a social campaign, increased awareness, and it was a wonderful way to see social media engaging with collections and with paintings, so more than your typical just social engagement. Smithsonian Showdown, then, this summer, we saw 19 institutions, 28 contenders from departments within institutions, and 1 winner, Endangered Animal Babies I think everyone in here must have voted for them. And another way to kind of really have a friendly competition between your institutions, because we all know there are so many within the Smithsonian, and a great way for a membership campaign. I have been bombarded with membership emails, as I'm sure most of you in here have been, but it's a great way to kind of really, reach new audiences. And we at the Carnegie Museums of Pittsburgh took a cue from that this year and did our Clash of the Carnegies. It was our first sister institution competition. Right now, we're down to the final 4 images, so everyone go vote for Silver Clouds from the Warhol. And it's a great way to show that we are all creative, active, engaging institutions beyond our 4 walls, and it's wonderful to be able to work together to show that.
So the other thing I think is this idea that social is becoming physical, and this is in a couple of different ways. If you were in my session earlier, you know the Mobile Photo Now Instagram exhibition is something that we did where we got 45,000 Instagram submissions, and then we culled that down to put it together into a physical exhibition of 320 photos from 240 photographers from around the world. So not only did we do that, but also people showed up for the exhibition, and people came from all over the world and all around the U.S. to be there for the opening and also for a final Instameet, which is, I think, is another thing, is another way of things becoming social, becoming physical, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in another thing that we have.
So hacking social media for exhibitions. Some examples of this are Capture Parklandia, which was the Portland Museum of Art's Instagram campaign that encouraged people to explore the parks in their community and connected to themes of an exhibition, and their submissions were actually put on view in the gallery space. And this is technically 2014, but I included it anyway. LACMA is doing a campaign related to their Faces of America, where people can submit selfies through Flickr that then are generated in the gallery space, so they become part of the exhibition. And I just presented in the previous session in this room on Instaman Ray, which was an Instagram campaign and experience we offered at the Phillips collection that encouraged visitors to take photographs of mathematical models that were related to the exhibition of works by Man Ray, and post them to an Instagram account that was specially created for that exhibition. Our number 5 is, I advanced on my computer, not up there. Working with influencers. So I think everyone in this room is probably very familiar with the phenomenon of empty Met and some of the social media campaigns that spun out of that at these other institutions we've got listed on the screen. And something that we were talking about as a group is the challenge of working with an audience of influencers. Are they an audience you can cultivate and expand upon? Can you offer them some kind of educational experience, or are they members of the press? Is it something that's very much a transactional relationship? You're giving them an exclusive experience and you expect a certain amount of return on your investment. Yes.
And Snapchat is a thing now that that LACMA has gotten a ton of press for. There are a lot of other art museums. I found a couple science museums, and I would actually love to talk to anybody else about how you're using it and what you're finding is the benefit and value of it. So I think this is something we'll continue to see evolve as Snapchat evolves. And another plug, there's a session at 3:15 in which Snapchat will be discussed on irreverent storytelling.
And this is the year of live social video streams. Meerkat in Pittsburgh, Meerkat in Periscope. We've all been playing with these. I think consensus out there now is Periscope is winning. I've read a couple articles, though, recently that Meerkat is not dead. It is kind of doing a reorg and hopefully going to come out with some cool things. So don't give up on Meerkat yet. Just a few examples of events this year. At the Warhol, we did a screening of never-before-seen footage to celebrate 50 years of video art. We had 495 live viewers and 200 replays, which were our first promoted Periscope screening. We thought was pretty great. The Children's Museum in Indianapolis did a Periscope screening of a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles exhibition. Couldn't see it, wish I had. That sounds awesome. Smithsonian Air and Space, Conversation with an Astronaut. Royal Ontario did it for Ask a Curator Day. And also it's happening at this conference too. We've seen it with Ignite. So questions we're asking when we're when we're using these platforms is who's watching, and are we engaging with them the same ways that we are on other social platforms? Does it matter if we are, because it's this ephemeral thing, and because these are supposed to be or intended to be these ephemeral streams, we have the opportunity to save the content. Are we saving that content and posting it elsewhere? Is that good? Is it bad? Something to think about as we go along.
And also from a government institution, I'll say there are challenges with the accessibility of those platforms, which is another thing that we could discuss.
So social media for social justice. This one should also have that plug for tomorrow morning session, putting social in social media, that is led by the person who started the hashtag Museums Respond to Ferguson. But this is one of those ones where we look at it and we see, as we began this session, with the dress, we're understanding that we exist not just in an ecosystem of other museums, but really in an ecosystem of national issues. And so when it comes to the big picture things like marriage equality, like Black Lives Matter, what is our place as cultural institutions? And I think this is one of those moments where we have to own that in some ways we've really won. Like the campaign for Love Wins was incredible because it had art museums, it had science museums, it had national history museums. It was great. But when it comes to Black Lives Matter, we haven't necessarily done as well. And I think looking at this, we look at it, we look at what worked, we look at what didn't, we look at what was problematic in our own institutions, and think about what we need to do to change that for the future.
And another plug, there's a session tomorrow on putting the social in social media that's looking at some of these topics as well. And so finally, I think this is number one just because of the massive amount of attention that Ask a Curator got and Museum Week got this year. These are two campaigns that have been happening for a couple of years. Ask a Curator apparently reached 63 million views and 237 million for Museum Week. And if you look at the number of countries, 600,000 tweets sent during Museum Week, just the scale is huge. And I think most of us are probably participating in these campaigns in some way. I think there are questions about, are we just reaching other museum professionals? Are we really reaching our audiences? What are we what is the impact of this? And what are kind of the long-term goals of this kind of energy that we put into these big campaigns? So these were all just a couple of highlights just from the past year, which I think just goes to show how much social media is always constantly changing. We all have to be on our toes, and there's a lot of really interesting, nuanced issues for us to talk about in the breakout. So let's see what the final results are here. What's that? Okay, so the winners appear to be the same as a few minutes ago. So I've prepared a slide that tells you. But you never know. I gotta be nimble, right? Gotta hear from the crowd. Okay, so here's what we're gonna do until 11 o'clock, which gives us a little more than half an hour. We've got kind of 4 little stations here, and we're gonna break out, and I think what we'll do is 1, making a bigger splash, collaborating with other institutions. 2, back in the corner, content strategy, what are we really trying to achieve? 3, are we really reaching new audiences? And 4, using social media for social change. And each of us is gonna hang out and take notes and help guide the discussion. And these are the things that we're really hoping to listen for, to talk about in the recap. So as we discuss these issues, what are the opportunities for us to collaborate after this conference on these issues? Are there resources people bring up or specific solutions or successes that we want to reflect out and share out with the community after this conference? So that's some of the things that our scribes will be scribing. Mm-hmm. And again, here are the 4 breakouts, and we'll talk for about 15 minutes at the end of the session. So we'll talk until 11. Thank you.
Do you want to point people to parts of the room?
Yes, so 1, 2, 3, 4.
Cool.
Okay. Awesome. Everyone, first of all, I would highly, highly recommend that if there was like a spin-off topic that you came up with that you want to continue talking to other people about, there are these swing space sessions on Saturday, and you can just sign up at the registration desk if you want to get a group of people to talk about something more. I recommend that for tomorrow. We're going to take the next 15 minutes and kind of go around. Maybe each group gets 4 minutes. Does that work out? 3 minutes? 3 minutes. And I'm going to kind of take notes on your takeaways and share out the whole slide deck for this. So if we want to start with number 1, which was making a bigger splash, and I'm going to give you the microphone.
Hello? All right, so we talked about making a bigger splash through collaboration with institutions, with our institutions specifically. First, we started with goals of collaboration. Access, awareness, attendance are goals of collaborations that have happened and are currently happening. Art Madness was a fantastic example of that. Maybe if we have time, we can talk a little bit. So Art Madness was a wonderful example of reaching a lot of institutions around the country and increasing access and awareness and showing that museums are not these stodgy places, but they're fun and engaging and active institutions. And then another goal for us now is people reaching people and building bridges. We're all here, we're all online, we are all available, but we don't always talk to each other. It's more at each other sometimes. The Facebook group, for example, is a fantastic resource, and a lot of times it's troubleshooting. It's look at this success or look at this failure or how can I do this better? Not, hey guys, I have an idea how we can all be involved in this one thing together. And Art Madness is a great way that that Facebook group, that social media managers Facebook group was used that way. And that's something that we can focus on and continue to build on. Challenge. We are all involved in these cultural themes like Museum Week, National Cat Day, whatever they are, and they have great action or great engagement that day, but we can capture the energy of these shared events and build on it. So thinking about how we can capture this energy is another thing we need to focus on. And collaborating on days other than these sanctioned days. Like, why aren't we talking to each other on a regular Monday? That's another way that we can really start to work with each other institutionally. And a challenge, again, is senior staff buy-in. Again, that came through Art Madness. Museums not being able to partake in it because they didn't get buy-in from senior staff. So internally, how can we use our external resources at other museums to say, well, they're doing it because of X, Y, and Z, why can't we? So we can help each other that way, too. And then sometimes we're seeing like the Smithsonian Showdown and the Clash of the Carnegies, but these are city museums working together, but they're not reaching beyond. So why can't we do this together more often than we do? A great way is Google Hangouts. Let's have Google Hangouts with each other. There's no reason that we can't be there to actually talk through things rather than just posting and getting to it when we can. So those are our main points.
Awesome. Go collaboration. Yay. So I just want to make sure I captured this one bullet right. You were saying help each other is it sort of by sharing your strategy and how you were able to make something happen in your institution?
Yeah.
Sharing that with other folks like you and other institutions. Okay. Okay, awesome. So topic number 2, which is?
Content strategy. Woo! I think we should have brought the museum swear jar in here because we said content like a bajillion times. And so everyone go put your stuff in. So one thing that bubbled up immediately for us in talking about content strategy was this difficult balance between promotional posts and content and call to action posts and content for buying tickets, coming to events versus generating purely informational or I want to say content about works of art, about subject matters related to your institution. Susan, I'm forgetting your museum. The Franklin Institute is shifting from talking about themselves to just talking about the things related to the mission of their institution overall, which is really interesting in the social media world. So this is an interesting balance that we discovered, and it sounds like everyone is struggling with it, right? And it's hard to find the balance point between marketing and using it as an engagement platform, especially when people at your institution see it as a quick fix, a bullhorn, or a Band-Aid. I think that was a great analogy that Amy had, right? Yes. And then the fact that sometimes social media...
Can you repeat the analogy?
Bullhorn or Band-Aid.
Ooh, okay.
So it's, 2 B's there. Okay. I have awful handwriting, so I'm trying to remember. what we talked about. Oh, the other big thing that came up was like the definition of content, which I think we've been all struggling with throughout this whole conference. And is content all the information, the events, all the stuff that your institution is driving towards you that you have to triage to figure out what the priority is and how to organize it into something that has a strategy? Or is content that final post that goes out and offers that moment of engagement with your audience? So that was a really interesting definitional question we had. And we think it's both. I think this is what we came across. And then this idea of having too much content and what do you do with all of it? How do you triage? How do you make sure that you have a strategy that's consistent over an entire year and you're incorporating artists' birthdays or National Cat Day and balancing that with quick, we want to post this thing about an event and get more traffic and buy more tickets and that sort of thing. So finding that balance is a struggle. And then we had the opposite problem as well, that some institutions don't have enough content. And what I think we clicked down and discovered was part of the reason for not having enough content was not having an overall goal or strategy for the museum's social media. And that's something that kind of I think is bubbling up as the bigger thing, is having an overall strategy and goal, and one that balances both the needs of your audience and the audience specific to each platform with what your kind of rest of your institution is thinking the needs of that platform is for the institution. Did I forget anything? Oh, we talked about one thing post-conference about sharing engagement metrics, specifically comparing call to action posts versus just engagement posts. And I think that's something that everyone here, that would be really valuable to share those more not anecdotally, but more ad hoc throughout the year versus waiting to a conference. Anything else?
Fabulous.
Go content strategy.
Okay, so we had, are you really reaching new audiences? And one of the things is we talked a lot about the challenges and a lot about definitions of that. To begin with, like, you know, when you say a new audience, what do you mean by that? What is the actual measurable, you know, what is the measurable outcome of that? And are you talking about somebody who is new to the museum in general? Are you talking about somebody who's new to different programs? It could be somebody who is, maybe they've come to a family program, but then they come to an adult program. Is that technically a new audience or not a new audience? We talked also a lot about, again, sort of different, depending on the institution, your new audience, depending on the social media outlet, may be coming from different places. So for instance, at the Met, they have found that they're getting a lot more new audiences from Pinterest over Facebook. They get a 90% new audience from Pinterest versus 50% on Facebook. I think that's particularly interesting. And they were also talking about, it's a crocheting. One of the things that gets pinned is something that's from a crocheting group. So it's kind of like this interesting niche group it's bringing in an interesting new audience.
Can I ask a follow-up quick?
Yeah.
Follow-up? So how was new audience defined for that? Was it like a museum visitor? Or
That was
a
web.
website
In that
visitor?
case, it was a web visitor. So that was that. That's what they were defining as that. So yes. But see, again, that gets to what are you talking about? Are you talking about, is it a new web visitor? Is it a new visitor who's actually coming into the building? What are you saying when you're saying new audiences? The other thing we talked about is how, again, we brought up this idea of working with influencers. And so, for instance, for Museum Week, if everybody knows Seema, who's here from Cleveland Museum of Art, she has 57,000 followers on Vine. And during Museum Week, her Vine was the most viewed. It was like 1 million views or something like that on Vine. But as an institution, Cleveland Museum of Art's actual Vine was not viewed. Like, it was very, I forget what she said, 200. So the idea of that, like working with influencers, is a way that you can bring in new audiences, but then again, how do you measure what that is from there? The other thing we talked about was that idea of reaching teens. That's always like a big audience, big new audience that people want to work with, but how do you do that? There's a lot of control issues over that. A lot of times once institutions are ready to work with that audience and they want to work on a particular social media platform, the teens may have already moved on from that platform. So by the time you get basically the ability to do something like Snapchat or Instagram, they may already be beyond that. So we talked about that. We talked a lot about analytics being a challenge, not really knowing who your audience is, even if you have some degree of idea. And that's not something that oftentimes like will get worked into an internal database with your customer relationship management system. So that's not something where you're necessarily able to tell, because you can't, oftentimes you can't work with your development department or whoever's working on your customer relationship management to get something like a Instagram handle or a Twitter handle added to that. But we did also talk about, I think I'm going to go to this first before we talk about resources. Selfie stations as being an interesting visual representation of your audience, and the ability of that to be something that could have, we might not know the actual analytics of that, although if we built it in, we would. But that would be a really great visual representation of knowing that you're bringing in a new audience. And then the other thing, we do have a kind of a solution potentially for knowing your Facebook audience. Denver Museum of Nature and Science uses something on Facebook called Umble, which is an opt-in thing. And basically it will give you all kinds of information about your audience if you opt into that. So once they started using that, they actually particularly had members, which I was excited by that, knowing your members on social media all opted in, like thousands of them opted in off the bat. So I definitely want to take a look at that. And that's what we have.
Great. Thank you.
All right, so we're the last group, which is social media for social change. And I'm sure unsurprisingly to anyone, we identified a lot of problems. We also identified a few solutions. So I'm going to start with the problems. And please chime in if I miss anything. So one of the biggest concerns that we have is actually institutional policies. Are we even allowed to talk about social change issues? The line between are we allowed to educate and are we allowed to be activist? And we had a few representation from the government here, so they obviously have much more strict policies. But even in private institutions, we do see that there are concerns that people actually put blanket policies on not talking about these issues. We also identified a lot of us have collections that have really problematic images, whether it is that the imagery or the object has a racial overtone or is actually a symbol of racism, like the Confederate flag. What do you do with that? And also, one of the more nuanced ones was, what do you do with representations of people of color that are taken by people who are not of color? A lot of us have Edward Curtis collections, for example. How do you handle these images? The other thing we were looking at was, there's a high potential when we put these images online, even if we take a totally neutral stance, because there is no neutral stance on a lot of these things, there is the high potential to get called out on this by people. Which sometimes, as we pointed out, could actually be a force of good. If we're not allowed to make that statement, opening it up for someone else who is not bound by our institutional policies to make that comment can actually help us if we look at it in that way. Then we also talked about the fact, okay, so let's say you are allowed to make a comment on this, you are allowed to engage with this. How do you do that in a way that is reflective of real institutional change or policy and isn't just that gloss? How do you make it so that you don't have a Twitter account that appears to be really promoting, Black Lives Matter or inclusivity, and then when you get to the museum, there's nothing on view and everyone that you see is not representative of that? How do we actually create authentic experiences that represent who we are? And how do we create those tie-ins that really look at our ability to speak to that authentically instead of supplanting the voices of the actual people of color or institutions that are doing this work? Are we doing it because we actually believe in it, or are we actually just doing it for likes and follows? And there's one of those that probably is not a good idea. On the upside, we came up with actually some really good solutions that were definitely new to me in terms of how to look at this. One of the things we were looking at was perhaps if you can't make a comment, or if you don't want to be the one making the comment, it's more important for someone else to, looking at hashtags, whether it's creating your own hashtag around a problematic collection, around something that's an issue, and then letting people speak on that hashtag, or even going as far, we've seen a lot of Twitter takeovers that we talked about, where what if the person who should be having that conversation doesn't have access to the people who follow you? Can you offer them that access? Instead of saying, let's talk for you, can you give them that reach that your institutions have? Is that something that will be an option for you? We also talked about very specifically, how do you create hashtags that are supportive instead of supplanting? So AAPI, I'm going to say this wrong, AAPI is for Black Lives. It was the Asian American and Pacific Islanders for Black Lives Matter. So instead of jumping on something like All Lives Matter, which was strongly criticized, how do you create statements that are actually affirming and supportive and not supplantive? And then one of the other things I was really excited about that we came up with was really thinking about how we have an argument for why this is important. So not necessarily just that it should be important because it is social change and social change is inherently important, but actually defending it to your board and saying this is why our institution has a stake in this. That for some of us, that's easy. If you work at a museum that's devoted to African American history, there's an obvious tie-in. But for your institution, what is the reason why you have a role to play in this debate or in this discussion or in whatever it is? And if you don't have that reason, that may be why you're falling into that gloss, just doing it for the likes, bait and switch experience for your visitors. If you don't actually have a connection to this issue, or if there is not something in your museum outside of your social media team that's connecting to that, then you have a larger institutional problem that until you fix that, you're really not going to be able to create an authentic experience for social change on social media. And then the last thing that we were really excited about was actually this idea of we all have different problems and different resources. You know, some of us really have that lens that we can bring to collections and are actively using collections at other institutions to make that comment. How do you look at someone else's collection through what you know? And others of us have the collections, but we don't have the lens through either the lack of diversity on our staff or even in our cities. How do we create these partnerships that can actually help us do more together than we could do alone? So I think, did I miss anything in there? Oh my gosh, I'm sorry, I talked way too much.
Great. I had to squeeze it all in there. It sounds like you all had really engaging conversations. And these notes are awesome. So I'm going to tweet out the link to this so that you have all of this conversation. And I think maybe it's on those of us who kind of put the session together to figure out ways that we can continue to have this conversation throughout the year. But definitely the International Social Media Facebook Managers, the Facebook group International Social Media Managers is a place to start. If you are not already in that group, you should be. And then we'll figure out other ways that we can connect with you all. Thank you so much for coming.